Here's the cavity for the right frontal sinus. There's a left one, too, on the other side of this partition. The frontal sinus extends upward behind the lower part of the forehead and also, to a variable extent, backwards between the roof of the orbit and the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. Here's the cavity for the right maxillary sinus, also known as the maxillary antrum. It extends backwards to the part of the maxilla that borders the pterygomaxillary fissure. It extends downwards almost to the root of the upper molar and premolar teeth. The medial wall of the maxillary sinus is also the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Its roof forms a large part of the floor of the orbit. The sphenoid sinuses occupy the central part of the sphenoid bone. This opening has been made to show the right sphenoid sinus. To see it better, we'll look at the skull divided in the midline. Here's the right sphenoid sinus again. Above the sphenoid sinus is the floor of the anterior cranial fossa and the sella turcica. Behind it is the basilar part of the occipital bone. In front of it is the high part of the nasal cavity. Below it is the roof of the nasopharynx. Lastly, we'll come round to the front to look at the collection of small cavities that contain the ethmoid air cells, collectively referred to as the ethmoid sinus. These extend from just behind the nasolacrimal duct all the way back along the medial wall of the orbit. As we've seen already, the ethmoid air cells lie between the medial wall of the orbit and the lateral wall of the upper part of the nasal cavity. All of this is the ethmoid bone. This part, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, forms a large part of the bony nasal septum. This upward projection is the beginning of the crista galli, which rises up in the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. On each side of the crista galli are the cribriform plates, which we've seen already from above and from below. The most lateral part of the ethmoid bone is this paper-thin layer, the lamina papyracea, which forms this part of the medial wall of the orbit. Between the lamina papyracea and the upper part of the nasal cavity are the ethmoid air cells, as we've seen. The superior and middle conchae are also parts of the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is joined to the frontal bone above, the maxillae below, and the central part of the sphenoid bone behind.